The shuttle's doors opened with a soft hiss, and the crowd inside the space station hall seemed to shift as if sensing something unusual. Among the many beings of every size, shape, and color, a single figure stood out, not because of brilliance or power, but because of stillness. She was tall and slender, her silver skin shimmering faintly under the cold lights, almost like liquid moonlight. Her hair, a flowing cascade of pale blue, framed a face that was both delicate and strangely sharp, with eyes that glowed softly like twin lanterns in a foggy night. But nobody noticed her. Or rather, they chose not to. Whispers ran through the hall. A few aliens nudged each other and looked away when she passed. Some avoided her gaze completely, as though her presence alone might bring trouble or misfortune. A seat near the center of the hall remained empty, though dozens of others had long been taken. Elira, as she was called, didn't mind the avoidance, but her heart felt heavier with every passing moment. She had come to this station for help, for support, for understanding, and instead the entire room had turned her into a shadow. Elira had crossed the void of space from Leora, her home planet, carrying a mission that could save thousands of lives. Her people were on the brink of war, caught in a conflict that would destroy generations if left unchecked. She knew the dangers of traveling alone among strangers, but she also knew her message could not wait. Yet standing in that hall, surrounded by countless delegates from hundreds of worlds, she realized that even survival might not be enough if no one would listen. And then she noticed him. He was human. That in itself was not strange. Humans were becoming more common in interstellar gatherings, but he was different. While the others whispered, laughed, and pointed fingers, he looked at her. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with a quiet attention that made her heart skip. His eyes held something she hadn't seen in a long time: recognition. He saw her, and it was not out of duty or obligation, but out of genuine curiosity and perhaps kindness. Caleb had been trained for moments like this: diplomacy, negotiation, the careful balancing of alien politics. But he had never felt a pull like the one drawing him to Elira. There was something fragile about her presence, something unspoken, like a candle flickering in the darkness. And in a hall where everyone else treated her as invisible, he felt an urge he could not ignore. He walked across the polished floor, moving closer, careful not to disturb anyone, yet deliberately breaking the walls of indifference around her. Elira's glowing eyes followed him, startled at first. She was not used to being approached with warmth. Most of the beings here had either ignored her or regarded her with suspicion. Even when she spoke, her words often fell into empty air. Yet this human moved differently. He did not approach her to question her origins or to mock her features. He approached her simply to share space, a quiet companionship in the midst of cold indifference. The whispers continued, soft and bitter, but Caleb seemed to tune them out. He extended a hand toward the empty seat beside her, a simple gesture that carried more weight than any grand speech. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked in his calm, human voice, gentle but confident. Elira hesitated. She had not expected anyone to acknowledge her presence, let alone invite her to sit beside them. Her lips trembled slightly as she nodded, and for the first time that day a small spark of warmth spread through her chest. It was strange, this feeling of being noticed, being valued simply for existing, in a universe where she had always been, sidelined, overlooked, or dismissed. This tiny act of inclusion was powerful. As Caleb lowered himself into the seat, he gave her a reassuring smile. There was no rush, no expectation, just the silent promise that she was no longer alone. Around them, the room remained busy with activity, but Elira felt a kind of quiet sanctuary form in that small space beside the human. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel hope stirring where doubt had long lived. The shuttle doors had opened a moment ago, and with them came the beginning of a journey she could not have imagined. She did not yet know that this human, just one among billions in the galaxy, would change the course of her mission, her life, and the way the universe would see her. But as she settled beside Caleb, a small, unspoken connection formed, fragile, yet unbreakable. In that crowded hall of indifference, she was finally seen. And in seeing her, Caleb had unknowingly set the first stone of a chain reaction that would ripple across worlds, showing that sometimes one small act of courage could illuminate even the darkest corners of the galaxy. For hours, Elira sat beside Caleb, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her seat as she watched the crowd around them. The space station hall was alive with movement, voices overlapping in dozens of languages. Delegates and travelers hustled, past, their expressions a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and sometimes outright disdain. Elira's presence seemed to stir only discomfort or judgment. Every glance that passed her way was either cold, dismissive, or full of whispered warnings. She had grown used to it over the years, people avoiding her as though her existence could bring misfortune. But the sting never dulled. She glanced at Caleb, who had not moved. He was sitting with ease, observing her as if the crowd did not matter at all. There was something calming in his presence, like a small anchor in a stormy sea. He did not ask questions yet, but he did not rush her either. He simply gave her space to breathe and exist, a kindness she had almost forgotten was possible. Elira's voice finally broke the silence. Why would anyone treat me like this? She asked softly, more to herself than to Caleb. Her glowing eyes lowered, reflecting the faint light of the hall. There was a sadness there that she could not hide, the weight of countless moments where she had been ignored, dismissed, or mocked. Caleb leaned slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Because most people are afraid of what they don't understand, he said calmly. They see difference and assume danger, but not everyone has to be afraid. His words, simple and human, struck a chord deep within her. Elira had expected judgment, hostility, or even indifference, but a voice that spoke to her truth, that saw her as more than a shadow. That was new. It made her heart flutter with a cautious hope she had long thought impossible. Around them, the murmurs continued. A tall, four-armed alien from a distant system sneered as he passed. She's wasting space. Why is she even here? His voice carried just enough to sting. Elira drew her shoulders back, trying not to shrink beneath the weight of his scorn. Caleb did not flinch, and his unwavering calm gave her the courage to lift her chin. I'm here because I have to be, she said quietly. My people, they are in danger. I need help. Her voice was firm now, carrying a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. For the first time, she spoke not to plead for attention, but to state her purpose. Caleb nodded encouragingly. Then speak, he said. You have every right to be heard. Elira felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. No one had ever said that to her before. Even at the highest councils on Leora, her words had often been interrupted, ignored, or twisted. But here, beside this human, she felt her voice gaining weight, her presence gaining strength. Minutes stretched into an hour. Elira began to observe the room with new eyes. Every delegate she had assumed would continue ignoring her, now paused at least for a moment, when they saw her beside Caleb. There was an unspoken ripple moving through the crowd. Curiosity. Some whispers turned into questions, others hesitant nods of acknowledgement. The invisible line she had lived behind for so long was thinning. For Elira, the sensation was overwhelming. She had spent lifetimes walking through corridors where no one noticed her, where her voice dissolved into nothingness. And yet here was a human who had chosen to sit beside her, whose mere attention was enough to begin breaking the walls around her. A small, simple act, a shared bench, a quiet presence, was shifting something fundamental in how the world saw her. She dared a small smile, and Caleb returned it with a soft nod. No words were needed. It was a silent conversation of recognition, of acknowledgement, of hope. Elira felt her heart lift slightly, the first time in years that the crushing weight of invisibility had eased. As the hour passed, she realized something important. The universe was not as cold as she had believed. It was not perfect, and it was certainly not fair, but kindness existed in the most unexpected forms. And sometimes, It only took one person, one small choice to remind her that she was not alone. Elira took a deep breath and looked around again. The hall remained busy, but her eyes no longer felt the sting of neglect. Beside her sat a human who had chosen to see her, and that choice was more powerful than any dismissal, any whisper, or any judgment in the room. And in that quiet, crowded hall, Elira felt the tiniest spark of courage ignite within her, a spark that promised she would no longer be ignored, not if she could help it. The hall around them was still noisy, but to Elira it felt quieter than it had in years. Sitting beside Caleb gave her a strange sense of safety, a fragile shield against the indifference and whispers that had followed her across systems. She took a deep breath and let her hands rest on her lap, her glowing eyes reflecting the soft light. For the first time she felt she could speak without fear, without the crushing weight of judgment pressing on her chest. I didn't think anyone would notice me, she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes flicked to Caleb, searching for some sign of judgment, but found none. Instead, he nodded, encouraging her to continue. "You do," he said simply. "I notice you, and that's enough to start." Her lips curved into a faint, hesitant smile. His words were so human, so simple, yet they carried a power she had not felt before. Elira had traveled across the stars with important missions, diplomatic letters, and urgent warnings, but never had she felt seen. Not truly, and here was a human, a species she had always considered limited and impulsive, showing her a respect that many of her own kind had denied her. She took another deep breath and began to speak, slowly at first, testing the waters. "I come from a world called Leora, my planet. It is on the brink of war. Our leaders cannot agree, and if we fail, countless lives will be lost." Her words were calm but filled with urgency. For years she had carried this burden alone, watching the future of her people grow darker with each passing day. Caleb listened intently, his eyes fixed on her as if the rest of the hall had ceased to exist. He did not interrupt, he did not judge. He simply listened, allowing her story to unfold in its own time. That simple act of giving her attention without demanding anything in return made her chest ache with gratitude. "I have traveled far," Elira continued, her voice growing steadier. "I sought help from other systems, but I am ignored. My words are dismissed. They say I am too young, too fragile, too different. They do not see the urgency. They do not see the lives at stake. And now I am here hoping that someone, anyone, will listen." Caleb's expression softened. He reached out, gently resting a hand near hers on the bench, not touching, just close enough to offer silent support. "You're not invisible anymore," he said. "At least not to me. And I think if we start small, maybe others will see you too." Elira's glowing eyes widened slightly, emotion threatening to spill over. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like this. Most people treated her as fragile or strange, something to avoid. But Caleb treated her as a person, as a being whose words mattered. His presence gave her courage, a small spark in the dark that reminded her of what she had almost forgotten, that she could matter, that her mission could succeed if she had someone by her side. They spoke for hours, though it felt like only minutes. Elira shared the details of her mission, explaining the fragile alliances on Leora, the factions on the verge of violence, and the desperate need for a neutral voice. She spoke of her fears, her loneliness, and the immense responsibility she carried on her shoulders. Caleb responded not with solutions or commands, but with questions, simple, thoughtful inquiries that encouraged her to think, to explain, to trust herself. Around them, the whispers and movements of the hall continued, but Elira no longer felt small. The presence of a single human who chose to notice her and value her story had shifted something inside her. For the first time, she felt like she could step forward, like her voice could reach further than she had ever imagined. As the hall's light reflected in her glowing eyes, Elira realized a truth she had never allowed herself to admit. Sometimes, hope comes not from power or recognition, but from the quiet act of someone caring enough to listen. And in that crowded, noisy hall with voices ignoring her existence for hours, Caleb had done exactly that. He had chosen to sit beside her, and in doing so, he had given her the courage to speak, to be heard, and to believe in herself again. For the first time in a long time, Elira felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The quiet moment between Elira and Caleb did not last long. The hum of the space station hall carried more than chatter and footsteps. It carried eyes, judgment, and attention that neither of them could ignore. A tall, sharp-featured alien, adorned in the ceremonial robes of a high-ranking diplomat, approached with long, deliberate steps. His multiple eyes glimmered with suspicion and disapproval. When he stopped before them, the murmurs of the crowd seemed to intensify. "Human," the alien said, his voice cold and cutting, echoing unnaturally in the hall. "Why do you waste your time on her? She brings nothing of value to this gathering. She is insignificant." Elira stiffened, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. She had expected indifference, whispers, even ridicule, but not open confrontation so soon. Her heart beat faster, a mix of fear, anger, and uncertainty swirling within her. For years she had learned to shrink beneath the weight of judgment, to speak only when forced, to accept that the universe would overlook her. And yet beside her sat Caleb, calm and unyielding as if he carried an invisible shield that deflected the alien's hostility. Caleb's gaze met the diplomat's directly. "She is not invisible," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the rising tension in the hall. "She deserves to be seen, and if you cannot see her worth, that is your failure, not hers." The hall fell momentarily silent. Delegates paused, whispers faded, and all eyes turned toward them. Some seemed shocked that a human would speak so boldly, challenging a figure of such authority. Others looked curious, uncertain. Elira felt a shiver run down her spine. She had never imagined anyone would defend her so openly, especially in front of a crowd that had spent hours ignoring her existence. The diplomat's many eyes widened in outrage. "You dare to question me?" he hissed, his voice rising with indignation. "You are nothing but a primitive human. You overstep your bounds." Caleb did not flinch. He leaned back slightly, maintaining his calm, his presence unwavering. "I am human, yes," he replied. "But even humans understand respect and fairness. And right now she deserves both." Elira could hardly believe what she was hearing. Fear, which had clawed at her chest for years, began to fade, replaced by something new: strength. She had spoken for hours, laying out her fears and her mission. Yet it had been Caleb's courage that made her words matter. His choice to stand by her, to acknowledge her presence, had shifted the energy in the room. Delegates began to murmur again, but this time the tone was different. Some leaned forward, curiosity replacing indifference. Some exchanged glances, questioning the authority that had previously dismissed her. For the first time, Elira sensed that she was not completely alone. The invisible walls around her were cracking, and she could feel the beginnings of recognition forming in the crowd. Elira took a deep breath, steadying herself. The fear that had always accompanied her in public spaces began to loosen its grip. She realized that she did not need to shrink or hide any longer. She could speak, she could stand, and she could be seen, not because she demanded it, but because someone had chosen to care enough to notice. The alien diplomat took a step closer, his voice sharp. "Human, you will regret this. She is weak, unworthy of attention. You risk embarrassment." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained composed. "If seeing her as weak is your concern, then that is your problem. But I will not allow anyone to treat her as if she does not exist. Not here, not now." Elira felt a surge of gratitude and something else, something fierce and unyielding. For the first time she understood the true power of being acknowledged. It was not only validation, it was protection, courage, and hope all at once. The simple act of one human choosing to sit beside her had transformed her fear into resolve. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Other delegates shifted uneasily, some whispering encouragement, others weighing their own judgments. Elira realized with a mix of astonishment and relief that Caleb's courage had changed more than her own experience. He had begun to change the perception of everyone around them. For the first time in a long while, Elira felt a strange, thrilling sensation, the beginning of possibility. She could no longer be ignored. She could speak, she could act, and perhaps she could even be heard. And all of it began with a single human's choice to defy the crowd, to sit beside her, and to believe in her worth when the universe seemed determined to overlook it. The tension in the hall hung thick, but something had shifted. Elira felt it deep in her chest, a stirring she had not felt in years. The alien diplomat had stepped back, his anger contained only by protocol. But the eyes of others were beginning to change. Whispers that had once been filled with doubt and dismissal were now tinged with curiosity. Beings who had ignored her for hours now glanced her way, hesitant but attentive. Elira turned slightly to Caleb. "Do you think they'll listen?" she asked, her voice small but filled with cautious hope. Caleb met her gaze and smiled softly. "Some already are, the rest, they will follow once they see you have something important to say. Just speak, I'll be right here." His presence was a steady anchor. It gave her courage not because he was strong but because he believed in her when no one else did. Elira had spent her life feeling invisible, as though her thoughts and words could vanish into the void without leaving a trace. But now, with Caleb beside her, she felt seen, valued, and empowered. Taking a deep breath, Elira straightened her shoulders. She began to speak again, this time louder, more confidently. "I am Elira, envoy of Leora. My world is on the brink of war, and we face decisions that will affect millions of lives. I have come to seek your counsel, your guidance, and your support." The hall paused. Beings of all shapes and sizes who had previously whispered about her in passing now leaned in. Some frowned with skepticism, but many nodded slowly, their attention captured by the calm determination in her glowing eyes. Caleb's quiet encouragement allowed her voice to flow freely. She explained the divisions on Leora, the fragile alliances that could collapse with the slightest misstep, and the urgent need for intervention. She described her people's fears, their hopes, and the consequences of inaction. Her words were not just a plea. They were a map of truth and urgency, delivered with the clarity of someone who had seen too much to remain silent. Slowly, the hall began to change. Delegates who had once ignored her now asked questions, carefully and respectfully. "What steps have you taken to prevent conflict?" one asked. Another, a four-winged diplomat, inquired about Leora's internal councils. Elira responded with precision, her answers confident, her tone steady. Each response drew more attention, more recognition, and more respect. She glanced at Caleb again and he gave a small nod, as if to say, "See? You are being heard." The simplest act of sitting beside her had become a catalyst, not just for her own voice, but for the way others perceived her. What had begun as quiet neglect was transforming into acknowledgement, curiosity, and even admiration. Elira's chest swelled with a strange mixture of relief and pride. For years she had carried the burden of invisibility, learning to make herself small so as not to be noticed or ridiculed. And now, that burden was lifting. She could speak, she could act, she could stand without fear. The alien diplomat who had confronted Caleb earlier remained at a distance, his expression guarded. But even he was watching, calculating, perhaps realizing that Elira's words and composure carried weight beyond what he had imagined. As the minutes passed, Elira noticed something remarkable. The energy in the hall was shifting not because of fear or intimidation, but because one human had chosen to believe in her. Caleb's choice to sit beside her had sparked curiosity, encouraged dialogue, and inspired respect. What had seemed impossible, being noticed, being heard, being valued, was now becoming reality. Elira felt a warmth spread through her chest. She realized that hope was not just a fleeting dream, it was tangible, born from connection, empathy, and courage. One act of recognition, one moment of belief had begun to ripple outward, changing perceptions, shifting minds, and creating opportunity. When she finished her explanation, a quiet applause began, hesitant at first, then growing steadily as more beings joined in. Elira's heart leapt. She had never experienced this before, acknowledgement that came not from power or fear but from genuine respect. She looked at Caleb, her glowing eyes shimmering with emotion, and whispered, "Thank you for sitting beside me." Caleb smiled softly, his voice quiet but full of warmth. "You didn't need me to speak. You just needed someone to notice you first." And in that moment, Elira understood a truth she would carry forever. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to believe in you, to sit beside you, and to ignite a spark that can change everything. The hall that had once ignored Elira now felt alive in a way she had never imagined. Delegates leaned in, asking questions, taking notes, and listening to every word she spoke. Each response she gave was met with curiosity and respect, a sharp contrast to the whispers and dismissive glances from hours ago. The alien diplomat who had confronted Caleb lingered at a distance, observing cautiously, no longer daring to dismiss her outright. Elira felt her chest swell with a mix of relief and pride. She had carried the weight of invisibility for so long, believing that her words would always fall into silence. Yet now she realized that recognition could be contagious. Caleb's quiet act of sitting beside her had created ripples that reached far beyond that small corner of the hall. Because he had believed in her, others were beginning to see her worth too. "You have a clear plan for Leora," a four-winged diplomat said, his voice steady and thoughtful. "And you present it with honesty. That is rare among delegates. Tell us more about your proposed approach to resolving the conflict." Elira took a steadying breath, her glowing eyes sweeping across the room. "My people are divided," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Some believe in war as a solution, others seek negotiation. I have proposed a council that includes representatives from all factions, with oversight from neutral allies like you. My hope is that through dialogue we can prevent bloodshed and protect innocent lives." Questions followed, probing deeper into her strategy, her knowledge of politics, and her ability to enforce agreements. Each time, Elira answered with clarity and confidence. She realized that the more she spoke, the more her presence grew, not because of fear or intimidation, but because her words held value. For the first time in her life, she felt the satisfaction of being acknowledged for who she was, not for what others assumed she could not do. Caleb remained beside her, offering silent support. His presence was like a steady hand guiding her, a reminder that someone had chosen to care. Occasionally he asked questions, but never to dominate or redirect the conversation. Instead, his inquiries helped Elira explain her mission more clearly, giving her confidence and showing the hall that she had allies who believed in her. A ripple of approval spread through the delegates. Some smiled, nodding in understanding. Others whispered to one another, sharing thoughts that had been unspoken for hours. Elira realized that her voice was no longer hers alone. It had become a bridge, connecting beings who had once ignored her, showing them that wisdom and value could come in unexpected forms. She felt a strange, wonderful emotion, belonging. For the first time in her life, Elira did not feel like an outsider, a shadow, or a mistake. She felt seen, appreciated, and capable. The weight of loneliness that had clung to her for so long was lifting, replaced by a quiet strength that she had almost forgotten existed. By the time the hall began to empty, Elira had answers, allies, and a renewed sense of purpose. Delegates approached her with requests for guidance and collaboration. Those who had once dismissed her now sought her insight, eager to support her mission to save Leora. The transformation was remarkable, and it had all begun because one human had chosen to sit beside her. When the crowd thinned, Elira turned to Caleb, her eyes glowing softly with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't just sit beside me. You gave me the courage to speak, to be heard, to be important." Caleb smiled gently. "You were never unimportant. You just needed someone to remind you of that." Elira's lips curved into a genuine smile, tears threatening to fall. She had faced rejection, doubt, and invisibility for so long that she had almost forgotten the feeling of being valued. Now, she understood that recognition could change everything. It could awaken courage, inspire action, and even shift the perceptions of an entire room. As she left the hall, Elira felt a quiet determination settling in her heart. She would carry this lesson forward, not just for herself, but for her people. And she would never forget the human who had made her believe that even the smallest act of recognition could change the course of her life, and perhaps the fate of her world. For Elira, the universe no longer felt indifferent. It felt alive, full of beings capable of understanding, listening, and acting with courage. And in that realization, she found a new kind of power, The knowledge that being seen, being heard, and being valued could change everything. The space station hall was nearly empty now, the echoes of footsteps and murmurs fading into silence. Elira stood at the edge of the platform, her glowing eyes scanning the last few lingering delegates. What had begun as a day filled with indifference and whispers of dismissal had transformed into something she had scarcely imagined: respect, recognition, and the possibility of change. Her chest felt lighter than it had in years, as though a burden she had carried for decades was finally lifting. She turned to Caleb, who had remained at her side through it all. He was calm, his presence steady, yet she could see a hint of pride in his eyes. He had not sought recognition or praise, but Elira knew that without him, none of this would have been possible. One small act, one simple choice to sit beside her had changed everything. "I can't believe it," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They actually listened. They actually respected what I had to say." Caleb shook his head gently. "You didn't need anyone to believe in you to be right. But sometimes all it takes is one person to remind others and yourself what you are capable of." Elira's gaze softened. For so long she had walked alone, bearing the weight of responsibility and the loneliness of invisibility. She had feared that no one would ever see her, that her mission would fail before it even began, because her words would vanish into the void. And yet here she was, not just seen but heard, not just heard, but valued. She thought of her people on Leora, their lives hanging in the balance, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. The respect she had gained here was more than personal, it was a bridge to hope. With allies now willing to support her, with voices joining hers instead of ignoring her, she could truly work to prevent the war, to save lives, and to bring her planet back from the edge of destruction. The hall's large doors opened, letting in the glow of the stars beyond. Elira looked out, imagining the journey home, imagining the councils that would finally take her seriously, imagining the lives that could be saved because of today. And yet her thoughts kept returning to Caleb, to the simple yet profound choice he had made. "Why did you sit with me?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. "Why did you care when no one else would?" Caleb smiled, a small human smile that carried warmth and understanding. "Because you mattered. Because sometimes, seeing someone when everyone else ignores them is the most important thing you can do. And because I knew that if someone noticed you, the world might start noticing too." Elira felt a wave of gratitude so strong it made her chest ache. For the first time, she understood that change did not always come from grand gestures, from power or fear, or even from the loudest voices. Sometimes it came from the quiet courage of a single person, the courage to stand beside someone who others have ignored, and to say without words, "You matter." "I see you." She reached out, placing her hand lightly on the edge of the bench where Caleb had sat with her for hours. The gesture was simple, but it carried a depth of emotion she could not put into words. In that moment, she realized that her journey, her mission, her fight, her life, had been forever transformed by this human who had chosen to care. Elira's eyes glowed brighter, reflecting a newfound hope and determination. She would return to Leora stronger, armed not only with plans and knowledge, but with the proof that recognition and belief could create real change. She would never forget the lesson she had learned. That courage, empathy, and the simple act of noticing someone could ripple across worlds, shaping destinies in ways that power and fear never could. As she prepared to leave, Elira looked once more at Caleb. "I promise," she said softly, "I will carry this forward. I will make sure that no one else feels invisible the way I did." Caleb nodded, his expression serene. "And I will be proud to see it happen." With a final glance at the stars beyond the hall, Elira stepped forward, her heart light, her spirit unbroken, and her purpose stronger than ever. The universe had tried to overlook her, to dismiss her, to make her a shadow. But thanks to one human's courage, she had found her voice, and with it, the power to change everything. And in that moment, Elira knew the truth she would carry for the rest of her life. Sometimes, being seen by even one person is enough to spark a beginning that no darkness can ever stop.